Hello, and thank you for viewing my project for DES 205, Level Design and Scripting. My name is Brenton White, and I was the creator of this project. This project is a somewhat darker take on the fourth brief, Natural World, in that the entire game loop revolves around using a magnet gun to manipulate the physical positions of different types of blocks in order to progress, whilst also bearing a distinctly claustrophobic vibe that is reminiscent of being a replaceable test subject in an experimental maze. It should come as no surprise that my primary inspiration for this project was Valve's Portal, although unfortunately I lacked the time to implement my own take on GLaDOS. I'll begin by introducing you to the technical aspects of the game, starting with movement. The project was built out of a basic first-person template provided by Epic Games, the makers of the Unreal Engine on which it runs. As such, I only ended up making a single, but important, change to their predefined movement mechanics. You will notice that each of the movement sections now possesses a branching bool. I won't get into why this bool exists yet, but it is related to the death concept, which will be explained in detail later on. Upon booting the game up, the first thing the player will see are three types of blocks. Green blocks and blue blocks are physics-enabled blocks and can be interacted with, while gray blocks are not physics-enabled. This is also the beginning of the use of color to enhance readability, as the gray is the exact same color as the walls in order to imply a subconscious association with the wall's inability to be moved. In order to leave the room, the player must learn that green blocks can be pushed around, much in the same way that a player had to learn that they could jump over Goombas to proceed in Mario Bros. The player is also able to learn at this stage that blue blocks cannot be pushed, yet their different color from the gray blocks on the right suggests that they have an alternative function. How is this difference between the blocks accomplished? The blue blocks possess a weight that is 100 times that of the green blocks, clocking in at a comparative 15,000 units compared to the green's 150. As the player walks down the hallway, they will hear a noise. Looking behind them, they will realize that the door has shut and they cannot go back. This is due to a collision with a trigger box that has closed the door. Let's look at how the relevant blueprints are structured. Upon collision with another actor on the trigger box, a command is sent to a door that is referenced in the editor for each trigger box. On the door itself, a simple Move Component 2 action occurs whenever the appropriate box is touched. Looking back at the trigger itself, it then plays a sound that will only play on the first collision, due to it being dependent on a bool that is switched to true upon contact. The lighting used in the level is just a series of spotlights pointed in specific directions to guide the player through the complex. It is frequently used to guide the player around corners. As in earlier versions of the level before the lighting was rebuilt, playtesters were getting turned around and losing their way. When the player arrives at the gun rack, they have two choices: inspect the blue blocks they've already seen that seem to block some kind of passageway, or approach the gun rack directly. Given the overt nature of the gun rack's design, most players will approach this instinctively, ultimately hitting the trigger box, which activates the function Gun Pickup, making visible both the character's hands and gun, as well as the UI in one swift set of events. It should be noted that the Game UI widget was actually created at the start of the game, but all widgets are invisible by default, requiring triggers to reveal them. The magnet gun by default starts on the pull functionality. The UI is specifically color-coded to indicate to the player which blocks the function interacts with. This also applies to the switch function, showing the opposite color to the active one. Additionally, the UI is shaped like a computer mouse to indicate what controls the usage of the tool. Whenever the player activates the magnet gun, it performs multiple bool checks. First, it checks if the gun has been collected. If it has not, the function goes no further. If the gun has been collected, it then checks which mode is active via the pull active bool check. Pull active is set to true by default, as I did not want to force the player to switch to the needed mode in order to progress. As a quick aside, whenever the player presses the right mouse button, it activates a simple function that swaps the state of the pull active variable. As for the function of the gun itself, the push function is simple to explain. It is a slightly modified variation of the standard shooting mechanic included in the first-person example map provided by Unreal Engine 4, in which an object, in this case an invisible object to create the illusion that it is a force instead of a bullet, is created and propelled forward to push objects it impacts. In addition, a custom sound that I created and altered is played on its use. The push function is a little more complicated. Although physics is enabled on the blue bricks to permit natural gravity to affect it, its weight is so excessively high that no amount of force the player can generate will move it. This is where the magnet function that I discovered in an online tutorial comes into play. This tutorial taught me to create an object that is then attached to the player. This object is an invisible object that additionally has an overlapping sphere created a few units in front of the object so as to attract blue bricks to the front side of the player. This in turn also limits the distance at which blue bricks behind the player are affected. Once the object is created and overlaps with a blue brick, it then triggers the Move to Player event in the blue brick blueprint, and then proceeds to destroy itself after a fraction of a second. The blue bricks use the equivalent of an on-off light switch called a gate function. On every event tick, it checks to see if the gate is open, as it begins the game closed by default. At any tick in which this gate is open, the opening of which occurs whenever the player uses the magnet gun pull function, the brick attempts to alter its world location, with the world location it seeks to move to being the location of the player, as established in this vinterp2 function, in which it compares its own location to the location of the player, and then moves it at a rate determined by delta time, essentially creating a constant speed at which it pulls. Lastly, after a fraction of a second, the brick will then proceed to close its own gate, ceasing all movement as a result, until the player opens the gate again via creating another magnet using the pull function of the gun. With this, almost all core blueprint functionality of the gameplay loop has been explained. To explain the last parts of the blueprints, we must proceed into the main room.